Welcome to Brain Chat. I'm Dr. Mitzi Joy Williams, your board-certified neurologist and MS specialist, and my mission is to engage, educate, and empower those affected by MS to become an active part of their healthcare team. Here on Brain Chat, we'll be discussing all things MS, health and wellness, advocacy, and we'll even throw a little bit of music and music therapy in there as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next episode. Happy Monday, everybody. It's Dr. Mitzi, the nerdy neurologist, and I am so excited to be here with you all again. It feels like it's been several weeks since we had Brain Chat, and that's because it has. We had the 4th of July holiday, and then also we just finished an amazing event at the Apollo Theater in New York City, talking about health equity and multiple sclerosis. It was just a phenomenal time, and I am so excited to be back with you all and to be talking about a topic that I think is very relevant. We call it part of our Sizzling Summer series. If those of you who are viewing today saw our last Brain Chat, we had a great discussion with the fellas. We talked about sexual dysfunction. We talked about all the things. And now we're going to broaden it up to talk, to all of those living with multiple sclerosis or chronic conditions. We're going to talk about sexual health. And I've got an expert with me tonight. So let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Lara Steppelman. Dr. Steppelman and I go way back to my days at the Medical College of Georgia, now Augusta University Medical Center. It's gone through a couple of name changes since I was there, but I've known her for a long time. She's such a passionate advocate, for those with MS. She's also done a lot of work in the HIV space and the LGBTQ plus space. I mean, just an amazing and knowledgeable person, not just about sexual function, but also about depression and other mental health issues related to MS. She is a PhD, and she is the chief of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry and Health Behavior, as well as the associate dean for faculty success and inclusive excellence at the Medical College of Georgia at Augusta University. She's a health psychologist who's focused her clinical work, teaching, and research on assisting others to live well with chronic illness, particularly HIV and multiple sclerosis. She's especially interested in access to competent mental health care for individuals, which I know that's a whole topic in and of itself. We may get to touch on that a little bit if we have time. But also, looking at those who have barriers to care and experience health disparities related to sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as race and ethnicity. She has published numerous papers, done presentations nationally and internationally. I've had the pleasure of working with her on multiple presentations and look forward to us chatting tonight. All right. Welcome, Dr. Steppelman. Welcome to Brain Chat.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. It's so good to be here and so good to be talking with you tonight.
Absolutely. So, before the show, we were having a little chat in the green room. Well, I guess the digital green room, and we were talking about how, before we would do a presentation, we would meet up at the back of the restaurant, right? Because the conversation was a little racy, right? We didn't want to be like in the front with the graphics and PowerPoint slides, etc. So we're going to have a back of the restaurant chat tonight, and I'm really looking forward to it. For those of you who are logging in, let us know where you're logging in from. You can just put it in the chat. And if you have questions, you can post them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as they are, if they're broad and kind of apply to everybody. So with that being said, Dr. Steppelman, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into this space, because you've been doing this work for a very long time before it was kind of in vogue and popular to do. So tell us how you became passionate about, helping folks in this space and particularly working with sexual function.
Yeah, sure. So I would trace it back actually to high school. I grew up in the Northeast, and back then we had Dr. Ruth Westheimer, who was always talking about sex. And I adored her. I loved how open she was and how she made it like this was just a part of healthy living, to know our bodies and know how to be intimate with one another. And I was really attracted to that, and the intersections of things like the AIDS crisis happened while I was in high school, and people started dying related to their identity and their sexual behaviors. And so by my senior year in high school, actually my senior project was a survey on sexual attitudes of seniors in my high school class.
Wow.
And so I actually thought I
Did they
might,
tell the truth?
huh?
Was it an anonymous survey?
It
Did
was
they
an
tell the
anonymous
truth?
survey. It actually got me into my college that I wanted to go to.
Wow.
I was on a wait list and they said, send us something you've written. And it was the only thing I'd written. And so I sent it and they let me in like a week later. So you
Awesome.
could say like sex really like actually was like the foundation, you know, of the fact that I do HIV work and LGBTQ work and sexual health work. And so, yeah, it started really early. It never really went away. And as I became more and more interested in both chronic illness, of which MS was one, but many chronic illnesses and chronic pain, and then these intersections with sexuality and sexual health, and then becoming a psychologist, they just all started to meld together. So when I had the opportunity to start working in the MS clinic, I thought, oh my God, this is like all of it all wrapped into one. And so,
Right.
and the thing that like got me talking a lot more about sex when I was there is people weren't talking a lot about sex.
People
I
were
was like,
talking a lot about it.
yeah.
Absolutely. So I think it's important, right? So, before we kind of, get into nitty-gritty details, to an extent, um, why is talking about this important? I think one of the main reasons is obviously, as you just said, people aren't talking about it enough. I remember when we used to do talks in Augusta, you would say, everybody's homework is to go home and the next visit, ask Dr. Williams a question about your sexual function or something like that, or talk to Dr. Williams about sex, which spurred many, many interesting conversations. But I think that even though, it's so much more in the open when we look at television, when we look at everything, people are still kind of hesitant to talk about it. So why is talking about or bringing up this topic so important?
So, I mean, in terms of its importance, I think that has to do with when we're looking at all the aspects of what makes up quality of life, right? It's about the things that bring us meaning, the people that bring us meaning, the work that brings us meaning, the spirituality that brings us meaning. And intimate connection, the literature shows it's highly related to having, a life of meaning that feels worth living and purpose. And so being able to express that to someone, and of course, people vary in terms of the extent to which that's important to who they are and their identity. But we should always start with assuming that it is important to their identity. And be able to, ask about that as one of the, just like of all of the facets that we would ask about a person's life and how they're doing. When I go see my primary care doctor, he covers like the whole wheel of different aspects of what creates meaning in my life. People aren't just, a combination of symptoms or different experiences, they're whole beings, and sexuality is definitely a part of our whole being experience. And many, many people struggle with it. So for as much as it's a part of an important part of quality of life, it's also one that when people are having a hard time, they're less likely to talk about. So we have a harder time intervening in that area.
Right, right. And I think it's so important, right? When we talk about wellness, I've really, gotten in the past decade or so, really in the past 5 years, even more, into this journey of really looking at the whole person. Like I've always felt like I looked at the whole person, but, really looking at wellness and, explaining it to people living with the condition. Listen, this part is just as important as this part. We don't say we only care about your legs and we don't care about your mental health, or we only care about, your vision and we don't care about this. And so we have to look at all of these aspects of ourselves as equally important and equally worthy of being addressed in the medical setting, and so that's something I really have been trying to get across, in any talks that I give, and even when I'm just talking to people one-on-one, that all of these parts are important, and we can't just look at this part and not think that that doesn't affect all the other parts or the whole. Each of those parts makes a huge difference. So when we talk about sexual function or sexual dysfunction, there are some symptoms, that can be very common. In the medical setting, I may have, for instance, with the men, we talked a lot about erectile dysfunction at the last brain chat that we had. There may be loss of desire, there may be decreased libido. For some people, there may be loss of sensation, particularly if they have nerve problems in their spinal cords. So there are a variety of things, and we try to break it down kind of when we think about, categories of sexual dysfunction into three categories, right? So we say primary, secondary, tertiary, and we've done presentations where we talked about this. So primary, we think of as something directly related to multiple sclerosis, right? You've got a lesion somewhere, let's say in your spinal cord, and you can't feel maybe in your, genital area. And then there may be secondary, where you have a symptom like, let's say, spasticity or weakness that doesn't directly affect sexual function, but because you have that symptom, it interferes, right? If you can't move, fully like you used to be able to move, or if there's tightness or pain associated, it can affect that function. And then we have tertiary. Tell us a little bit about kind of tertiary sexual dysfunction.
Right. So tertiary sexual dysfunction, or the aspects related to that, really have to do with the emotional aspects of what having MS, what having struggles with our physical wellness and health really do to us. So one, it could be things like stress, because anyone out there with MS knows that MS has many, many kinds of stressors. It's a whole nother talk. Physical health stressors, financial stressors, right? Vocational stressors, all kinds of stressors. And so we know that there's a direct link between sort of sexual activity and interest and stress, particularly in relationships, that it can decrease it. And so stress, depression, anxiety, so it's sort of the part of the mental health cluster that can really interfere with sexual wellness. But then we also have these ideas about attractiveness and who we are that can change as our identity, as we start to integrate in what does having a chronic illness mean, what does having chronic pain mean, what does having limited mobility. People would tell us, when we would do our talks about like, a cane isn't sexy. If you remember, Mitzi, we would be like, you can wrap that cane in a
I'm
boa.
telling you, bedazzle,
right?
glitterize.
But the idea that like disability isn't related in many people's mindsets to being a sexually desirable human. And so what that does to our identity when we have mobility assistance devices or difficulty moving, it can change how we feel. And when we, when you hear people say, they've gained a few pounds and it makes them feel less sexy. Well, this is like, this can be a huge change relative to that.
Right.
And so that, and then also our ideas about sex, right? And what sex encompasses. We often use yardsticks of, how long someone can maintain an erection or the kind of intensity of the orgasm they have, or there has to be penetration. And so anytime we don't meet those yardstick standards, there tends to be some self-judgment or internalized stigma about, again, our worthiness as a person and as a sexual being. And so those are just some of the ideas of things that, beyond just, what MS does physically with our brain and spinal cord, but then also with all of the secondary things related to fatigue and spasticity and muscle weakness, but there's this whole realm of other things that often interfere.
Right. So there's the physical part, the lesions, there are symptoms, bowel and bladder issues, all of these things, which can be different in each person. But then there's also the mental and psychological impact. Something that we've talked about in the past that I'd like you to touch on for a minute is this idea of, we talked about body image physically if people can't move, but what about kind of changing of roles, right? People who may be used to be the primary breadwinner now have someone helping care for them. Talk a little bit about that and how that can impact a person's image of themselves as well.
Absolutely. So particularly sort of just starting with the idea of people who are in coupled relationships or relationships already, oftentimes people have roles that they play in terms of sort of who how people caregive one another,
Mm.
as you mentioned, who sort of brings in what resources or takes care of what resources in the household. And when those things start to change because one person develops significant chronic health issues and limitations, it can often change the way that they actually relate to one another.
Mm-hmm.
And for people, for example, who may need assistance with bowel and bladder things, like they're like, well, that can't possibly be sexy to my partner.
Right.
And so when we go from sort of having this sort of romantic relationship, in whatever dynamic that was, to where one person is really doing caregiving and often very intimate caregiving for the other person, that can
Mm-hmm.
become the priority. And it may become hard to see each other as sexual beings for both of them, for the person
Right.
being caregived, like, oh, now this is the person who takes care of me more in a parental role, and that's not sexy.
Right.
Or, so those are some of the role shifts that can kind of change, and really, needing to talk about that as we notice those are starting to occur.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, again, obviously it would take us hours to go into every single thing in depth. But, one of the things that I like to focus on Brain Chat is solutions, right? So we know that there are lots of problems. But I do like to focus on kind of where do we start? So, before we talk about kind of how we may treat or deal with these issues, let's first talk about how do you bring this up in the doctor's appointment, right? You're going to see your neurologist. They have a list of things. They're looking at your MRIs. They're asking you, are you okay? Everybody's reflex response is, yeah, I'm doing good, right? So let's say you get through that, you get through your MRIs, and you kind of want to talk about it, but you're not sure how to bring it up. How do you encourage people to bring it up, in their doctor's visits?
So that's a great question. I mean, the first thing I'd say is we got to get doctors and healthcare providers to start bringing it up regularly too, because
Absolutely.
the research shows that patients expect their doctors to bring it up. So when doctors and and PAs and nurse practitioners and all kinds of APPs as well, when they don't, advanced practice providers.
Mm-hmm.
So when the people that are caring for us don't ask about it, it sends a
Mm.
message it's not important, or it's something we don't talk about.
Mm.
So for patients, they have to break through that barrier of saying it is important for us to talk about. And so I encourage, and that's why I always encouraged everybody to go talk to doctor. I was like, you all need to talk to your doctors until you've embarrassed them so much that they just get over it, because the truth is doctors often aren't given nearly as much education to have these kinds of conversations as would
Mm-hmm.
be really helpful. So keep that in mind. But what I would say is, when patients are talking to their doctors, to think about what's the most important thing related to your sexual functioning. Are you worried some of your medications maybe have changed your sexual response? So we know that, things like antidepressants, which people are giving you for depression,
Mm-hmm.
often make having an orgasm extremely difficult. And
Right.
so if that's happening, you're going off your medications, then we're not only not treating the thing that you came in for, but then we're also not talking about the sexual dysfunction piece. And so part of it is empowering patients, and for each of you to remember that you deserve to talk about your sexual health. There is nothing stigmatizing about it. And that, when you develop a comfortable relationship with your provider, I've certainly talked with my own provider about sexual health stuff. And, what you
Mm-hmm.
hope is that you get a welcoming response to
Right.
that.
Right.
And so I would say the more you talk about it with your provider, the more they're going to be able to help you.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, so two things. You said so much good stuff, but two things I want to touch on. Number one, we get like no education
yeah.
about this, right? So I remember we were doing these. So before I started working at the MS Center, my predecessor and amazing mentor, Dr. Mary Hughes, was there. And you and Dr. Hughes had started these, talks about sexual function. And I I mean, we would have, patients lined up out the door to get into these, events. There would be, samples of things on the table. And there would be a person in the back of the room selling items. And the first time I went, I think my eyebrows were probably backed up to my scalp, like, oh my God, right? Because they don't teach you anything about this stuff in med school, And so I even remember the first talk I gave, I was a little bit uncomfortable. But over time, realize that, again, if we're talking about treating the whole person, this is an essential part of most people's, wellness to some extent, right? Whether they're in committed relationships or not, right? And so we have to be able to address it. We have to be able to help people find solutions, and not just kind of bury our heads in the sand. So I think that's a call to action for healthcare providers to educate ourselves, right? So that we can better help, those that we're serving. And then the other piece that I think was really important that you touched on is that there are many instances where we can have this cycle of symptoms, where we treat one symptom and it makes another symptom worse. And so oftentimes with symptom management, we have to kind of walk this tightrope, So, if someone is depressed, it can cause decreased libido. We treat the depression, but the medicine we give can affect can affect a person having an orgasm. And so then we have to figure out how can we make sure that we're walking that fine line, and not just that, but continuing to check in on progress to say, okay, is this better? Are we making this worse? Or how do we need to adjust or change course to make sure that we're addressing this problem but not making this other problem significantly worse? So I think that is also something that we have to make sure that we're addressing. And again, as physicians, and healthcare providers, if we don't know that there's an issue, we can't address issues that we don't know about. So we need to bring it up, and then people with the condition and their care partners can bring it up, and we can discuss it from there.
Yeah. And if you remember, whenever you check in, you always get your list of what's your visit today. And so if you're afraid to verbalize it, sometimes writing it down
absolutely
allows your provider to see it, and then they'll know you, and then they can kind of prepare themselves mentally when they look at it. So if you're afraid to talk, writing it down, just like when we do our talks, a lot of times we'll have where people can just hand in a handwritten question, because they don't want to verbalize it. So use those opportunities where your healthcare providers are giving you paper to write stuff down.
Yes.
If you're a little shy or embarrassed about bringing it up, and write it down.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, the other part, is bringing those loved ones, those partners to the visits, because sometimes they will bring it up for you, so it's a team effort, right? So, all of us working together to make sure that we come up with the best plan to treat each individual.
And now and everyone out there who's just listened to this radio show or the podcast has a perfect opening, right? I was listening to this podcast the other day about MS and sexuality, and I realized we've never talked about it. And
exactly.
Right. So
there it is.
And that's an example of the kind of opening that you can use when you're trying to create a little bit of space.
Exactly. Feel free to use Brain Chat as an excuse to bring it up. Just talk about Brain Chat. We're happy. That it is spurring conversations. All right. So we talked about kind of what's the problem. We talked about, how to bring this up, broach the topic, gave some suggestions, write it down, bring that partner or spouse or, loved one with you. You can bring it up together. So now what do we do about it? Right. So I think when we think about it, and how we treat, we can think about it in those same categories, right? So when we talk about primary, right, which is due to MS and MS lesions, of course, we want people checking in with their neurologist, coming up with the best treatment plan for their MS, right? Because ultimately, even though we may not be able to fix damage that's been done, we can try to prevent new things or new lesions from happening and worsening those symptoms, hopefully, with disease modifying therapy. All right. Then the second piece to that, when we talk about, secondary sexual dysfunction, those are the things where we talk about different symptoms, like, let's say, spasticity. If your arm or your leg is tight, You may not be able to move in certain positions. Also, if their bowel or bladder dysfunctions, people may be concerned that they may lose control of their bowel and bladder, which may make them hesitant. We also talked about symptoms like numbness and tingling or pain that can impact your ability to want to be in certain positions. And so it's important to work with your healthcare team to treat those things. And again, it's not perfect. There are some symptoms that we have treatments for. There's some that we don't have any treatments for, but we try to work together to try to adjust those, to try to make things as mobile and adjust as much as possible. But there are other things that can help. So let's talk first about how we address tertiary sexual dysfunction, and then we can talk a little bit about, other ways people can work together to create intimacy despite whatever physical changes they may have had related to their MS.
Is that a cue for me?
It is.
I guess the first thing I would say, just as you start this process, is, so when we first begin developing our sexuality, and hopefully throughout our whole lives, we approach it as explorers, right? Of, different things working for us at different times, adding new spice, all that kind of stuff to keep your sexual life vibrant. And what I would say is with MS, you're sort of like exponential explorers, like being open to trying things you haven't tried before, doing things differently, and trying to approach it with the same excitement that you might have approached, like, trying out doing things, with like negligees or toys or all the kinds of things that people use. Well, we're going to say, like, there's a lot of options for things like that. And so the first part of it is mindset, and putting away what I thought being a sexually, active person was before this diagnosis, and saying, I'm going to create who I am now. Because for those of you, like myself, who have a few decades on us, like, what that looks different in every decade regardless, and what you bring into it or let go of or change. And so in some ways, this is an opportunity to sort of do that and keep redoing it. And if you can look at it as an opportunity rather than as, oh, we can't do it exactly this way, therefore it's not going to be any good anymore. So I would say attitude is really the first part, because you can make it a lot of fun.
And park right there for just a minute. I want you to say that again for the people in the back, because we've had this conversation before about kind of looking at where we are right now, and learning how to not focus so much in the person that we were yesterday, because we're not that person today. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that's really key. I have many people who are just really hung up on, gosh, I used to be able to do this and I can't do it now. And of course, it's a loss and it's a grieving process.
Absolutely.
But at some point, we do have to say, okay, well, this is where I am. How do I move forward?
Absolutely. And whether you have MS or not, this is coming to a theater near you, because you will have to.
Listen, my knees don't work like they used to work.
Right. I mean, chronic pain, for those of us in our 50s, menopause, male aging and erectile dysfunction, particularly if you have other chronic illnesses like diabetes. So most of us are going to accumulate some things that are going to change the way in which we're intimate with people. And one of the worst things we could do is say, well, we can't do it that way, and kind of give up, which, by the way, is what a lot of people do, or settle for something very, like, less satisfying than it has to, because it's uncomfortable to talk about, not just with your doctor, but with your partner. And bringing up, I know I used to really love this, but I don't have a lot of sensation there anymore. So this doesn't do that for me anymore. But I've been thinking about these other things that might. But, if you haven't changed it up, and a lot of people do get into ruts, especially while they're parenting and things like that. Like, they're like, we're just lucky to have sex. We don't think about how to have different sex. So I think the focus always has to be on, what's underlying this. Because, we've done research on this, and other folks have done research on this, that the level of sexual dysfunction is actually not correlated as much as like in terms of like your happiness with your sex life, as is relational communication, right? And the quality of the relationship. So what that tells us already is the person with the most dysfunction isn't the most unhappy. So that's what we kind of have to remember when we're doing this, that there are ways to find things that we can enjoy. And, you know, when we're talking about, you know, tertiary symptoms like pain, you know, being able to get position pillows that help you more comfortably get into a position to hold, so you're not having to hold yourself in ways that your muscles don't work anymore, changing up the positions that you have sex in, also just not focusing on sexual intercourse, you know, while good cardio aerobic exercise or can be, you know, other forms of sex like manual or oral stimulation, which many people will say they actually enjoy or bring them to orgasm just as easily, if not easier, right? And tend to take a lot less energy, and you can do a lot more comfortably if you're having problems with spasticity and weakness and pain. And this idea of not focusing on, we must have like a big orgasm at the end, or we didn't, you know, have a good time. Because remember, again, this is about enjoyment of each other, enjoyment of your bodies, building intimacy, building relationship. And there are all different ways to achieve that. And that can be giving each other a massage, that can be cuddling, you know. So first of all, thinking about this array of things on the menu I can choose from. And if I've been stuck choosing only one and that doesn't work so well anymore, like it's time to start ordering some other things on the menu.
Right.
You know. And then the other piece of it is thinking about how can I accelerate the things that, so if I'm struggling, you know, so we don't want you not to have orgasms. We want you to, if you can have orgasms, we want you to be able to do that. And that may mean looking at using vibrators for increased stimulation. You know, I always share that, you know, my favorite time. Let's see, was it us in Fort Lauderdale together?
It was Fort Lauderdale.
I
was just talking to somebody about that.
Remember so long ago. So Dr. Williams and I gave our sexual talk, but we gave it in Fort Lauderdale, not being really prepared. And this is our naivety in a much younger age, that the entire audience was going to be in their 70s and 80s.
The entire audience.
The entire audience. And or the vast majority of them. And they were very interested, but they were very quiet. We thought we had done a terrible job.
We did.
The end where
we stopped at the break and we're like, we are bombing. This is horrible. Oh my gosh. And then we had trivia. We had people winning things in the back. And you had this, you know, 80-year-old guy with this big pillow like on his shoulder trying to carry it back to his seat. And it was crazy. But when we finished, they were like, this was the best talk we've ever been to. And there was a line, you know, down the middle aisle trying to get to the table, you know, to look at, you know, the items there.
Absolutely. And so about 6 months, a year later, I actually had a woman call me who had gone to the Fort Lauderdale talk. And she had been divorced and just starting to date. And she was going to travel with her new boyfriend for the first time. And she had been using, so the Hitachi vibrator is classically known as sort of like a very powerful one that also comes with a dimmer switch. So you can use it and kind of, if your sensation decreases over time, you can kind of increase the amplitude of it. But anyone that has one would know that it's large.
Humongous.
It's humongous. Like, this is not an exaggeration. It's used externally, by the way. So when I say that, Anyway, and she was like, I can't bring that. And what should I use? And I thought, oh my God, I've just won the like Sexual Health Academy Award. Like, this woman is like calling me for vibrator advice. It doesn't get any better than that. And so I actually found, like, we worked on what she was interested in, and I learned all about like the sort of different powers of vibrators, and we were able to find her one. And then and she followed me to talks whenever I came to Florida, like for a couple of years afterwards. Like, but that's the kind of thing of like, so it's being able to say, well, here's things that might actually increase that, right? So vibrators, because we know lubrication can be a huge issue,
Absolutely.
considering upping the quality of your lubrication that you use, and particularly water-based ones tend to be reabsorbed into the skin very quickly. So, for those of you who are using lubricants, well, if you're not yet, start doing that if you're having that problem. But if you aren't sure what you have, take a look at the lubricant that you have and see if it's water-based. And you might want to try a silicone-based one, which is the other standard one. It's not reabsorbed. I will say, like, it'll stain your sheets, it'll stain your clothes because it doesn't come out of
Be
things,
careful. Be careful.
you have to be careful with it. And that if you're using silicone-based toys, you should use a condom with it because it will deteriorate. It will deteriorate the silicone, and you don't want that being released into your body. So, but trying simple things like adding some toys like that, adding a better lubricant, adding a position pillow, you might be able to find that a good lot of the things you would have liked to have been able to do but were having trouble with, you could actually add some of those back. And then the ones that you can't, you can find adaptations and do other things for.
So it sounds like, some of the key things that you've mentioned so far is, number one, be open, right? Just like, we have changes in our bodies as we age. With MS, obviously those changes happen very quickly, and may be much different than what we would see with things like normal aging. But certainly be open to looking at things differently. Okay, well, just because I can't do this like I used to doesn't mean that I should just give up and quit. I think the second thing that you said is kind of reframing your thinking. I often use that example when I talk to people about exercise. When we think about exercise, we think, I go put on my, two-piece neon green outfit with the matching shoes, and I go to the gym and, do an hour on the treadmill and then 30 minutes with weights, and then I do this, and I said, okay, well, if exercise looks like parking a little bit further away from the grocery store and walking to the door, let's start there, right? We don't have to start with the three-piece outfit and pumping iron for an hour,
They can wear the three-piece outfit. Come on. Like, it's still wear the outfit. If a cute outfit gets you moving, I'm a big fan of whatever exercise I do to be a cute outfit in.
Well, yeah. So definitely the cute outfit, right? But it's the cute outfit plus like the 1 hour workout, video.
Right. The cute outfit, walking a couple extra parking spaces.
Exactly. Or just going to, I just walk to the mailbox in my cute outfit or to the P.O. box to pick up the kids.
I just know that you're doing it in a cute outfit. So
absolutely. Definitely in a cute. Okay. So let's reframe. So the outfit must always be cute. Okay. But let's do the cute outfit and let's maybe reframe how much we think we have to do to be effective. Right. And so I think that it really also applies here, right? Looking at, we don't necessarily have to do it like we used to do, but let's reframe and think about, how can we make this a positive experience, with the limitations, that we have now. And I think there are many different ways to do that. So 2 things I want to talk about, because we're getting close to time. I knew this was going to be a juicy conversation, but 2 things I want to talk about as we're getting close to time. Number one, where does a person begin? So we've talked about kind of general recommendations, but obviously MS is unique to each person. I think that certainly having those conversations with your physician, about treating symptoms is important. But let's say, your doctor doesn't know how to look up which vibrator or lubricant you should get. So where do you go, or where should a person start? Are there any good books or resources? And then the other thing I want to talk about is therapy. What is the role of therapy in helping people who are having, issues with their sexual function?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so there is actually a growing amount of information online related to sexual dysfunction, MS. Actually reviewed it, a little bit of it today before, just to kind of see, and it's all remarkably very similar and consistent advice. And so, whether you're talking about documents, written by any of the, so whether it's the Multiple Sclerosis Society, or Association of America, or the MSF, the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation, all the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. I don't know if I have them all, but I have almost all of them. but almost all of them have wonderful documents if you go to their websites on, and those are really good primers to kind of give you the basic information, thinking about what symptoms bother me the most. If I could have one of these things a little bit better, because that's where you start. You might have problems with lubrication, you might have problems with arousal, you might have problems with orgasm, you might have problems with pain, you might have depression too, but you gotta pick and start. And anywhere that you have success is likely going to build your motivation to keep going. And so I think Mitzi's start small with exercise really fits well here. And there are some good books you can look on Amazon in terms of overall sexual health and wellness books. There are some books specifically related to sex and disability. If you go in there, I can provide Dr. Williams with a list afterwards if she wants to have some of those posted for you all. We can get you the exact titles of sort of what the sort of best books are out there. If anyone in our audience, has found any books that or resource materials that they really like, then I would, certainly type them in the chat and let others know about them. That would be great. But there's good information out there. And then you're able to, everybody who works with me knows I'm a huge fan of Amazon because you get ratings and whether it's books or toys, or lubricants or other things, you can go there and they show up in just a regular Amazon box, not in a box like this is a box of sex toys.
Right.
Right. Beware. Nobody wants that. Or maybe they do, but
yeah. So again, doing research, right? And I use this analogy. All of us can be private investigators when we want to, right? So if, there's a hairstylist that we want to try out, or if there is some new procedure, we get online, we might go we search for different terms, we might ask our friends, we might go into the chats, and ask other people their opinions. So in the same vein that we do research to find out about, how we should get our nails done or how we get our hair or eyebrows done, let's apply that same energy, to improving this part of health, So, as you said, you can search for those terms, sex and disability on Amazon to see if there are books that are related. I'll get the list of books that you have, and I'll try to post those somewhere on our website after the show. But look into it and talk about it. I know that many people are talking about it in the different chats and support groups, so I think that's important. Right. So the other thing I want to talk about is therapy, right? So we can talk about a couple things. So talk about the role of therapy, please, in dealing with depression, anxiety, right? To help if that is a large component of sexual function. And then let's also talk about sex therapy. So, again, it's a discipline that has been around for a long time, but really is now more in the forefront. I don't recall in training people having business cards saying that they were a sex therapist. It was like, oh, it would be something we kind of whisper, that person is a sex therapist, but now it's very open, so what is the role, of couples therapy, for instance, in people who may be dealing with or trying to navigate some of these issues and reframing their thinking?
Yeah. I mean, so first of all, increasing your support network of who you're going to talk to about this is always helpful. And so whether we're talking about individual therapy, one-on-one, which would be the kind of therapy probably you would be doing related to working on your depression, so that's not, because the depression makes us tired, it makes us not interested in things. The treatments can make our sexual functioning worse, so being able to really look at the role of depression, anxiety, right? So not only just sort of the kind of anxiety we carry through our lives, but then also sexually specific anxiety of what if my performance isn't good. And so, as well as learning to manage stress better, all of those things are great for individual therapy of sort of working on those specific issues, as well as what has adding MS to one piece of my identity, you know, all the things that I've been, but now I'm also a person living with MS, what that's meant, what I've had to grieve. Again, a lot of that's really good work individually, one-on-one. There are many therapists trained to do this kind of work and do it very well. My specialty has always been adjustment to chronic medical conditions because it really does encompass all the aspects of wellness we've been talking about. And it can be a tremendous shock to people, especially when they are young and not expecting to have that many life changes. You know, so it's kind of the individual therapy piece. The couples therapy piece really comes into play first around just understanding where each other is at right now with where we are with MS and being able to communicate better, because, you know, I work with couples and they can barely communicate about who's going to do the dishes and who's going to take out the trash, let alone, you know, what do you think about these sex toys? Or, you know, I know we've never been into this kind of thing before, but it might work better than what I'm experiencing right now. And so learning how to have good communication and open communication, that may not start around sex, but hopefully it will get to that place with the help of a good couples therapist who knows that that's one important facet that you want to work on. Good communication skills, though, are good communication skills. So if you learn them, you can apply them to everything. And most of us already know when we think about our partners, whether we feel like we're good communicators and like the things that are really more challenging for us, like we find a way to talk about, you know, or are we the kind of person that like sweeps it under the rug? And if we're that person, we're definitely doing that around sex too.
Right.
And then the third thing, you know, in addition to couples therapy, then we talk about sex therapy, which could be individual or as a couple. And that's really focused on a lot of what we're talking about today. What are your expectations about sex? What did you grow up thinking good sex was supposed to be? Like trying to first understand the way in which people define healthy, good sex and understand how they've come to develop those ideas, and then really try to focus on sort of what would be the pieces that they would want to be different. And again, sort of this is sort of where you have a guided, you know, because many couples, when I say, you know, sort of be explorers together about this, explorers sometimes need a guide. And so this is like for sex therapy. You
don't get lost in the wilderness.
That's right. I mean, or get lost in the wilderness. Just have while to make it for a little while.
Right. Take the supplies with you. Yeah.
But having a guide can really help. And so, and sex therapists are also trained in specific types of therapies like sensate focus, where couples learn to sort of mirror one another in terms of how they're going to touch each other. And it's actually not focused on sex. It's actually focused much more on becoming connected to your partner and each other's bodies in sort of a much more whole way than just sort of genitalia focused intimacy. And so there are lots of techniques that people can use to, you know, increase ability to have an orgasm, prolong an erection. And sex therapists are really meant to kind of help you develop what I feel like is a very tailored approach. You know, MS is one of those things, as Dr. Williams is well aware, that, you know, this is definitely personalized medicine, like
absolutely
at its best. And like what one person and one couple come up with to create a meaningful, satisfying sexual life may look completely different from another couple based on their expectations, what they want to do, and because MS affects people so differently. And that's why I say, like, you have to have a little bit of patience and a little bit of explorer attitude so that you can put together a menu of things that really works in your life.
Absolutely. Well, our time is up. This has been an amazing discussion. So I've got to bring you back so we can talk about this again.
Thank you so much. Like
we just scratched
so great. I feel like we just got started catching up.
Absolutely. I mean, but this has been an amazing discussion and so needed, right? Because I think, you know, it's important for people to not be shy. We got to talk about it. And I think having these terms and trying to understand, that again, looking at where we are now and how we move forward is extremely important, and working with your healthcare team to address, these different issues, and also bringing in, other experts, whether it is, individual therapy for depression, anxiety, whether it is sex therapy, couples therapy, bringing in all of these multidisciplinary approaches can really help tailor, each individual's treatment plan. So, it's amazing. I mean, we've come a long way. I mean, you remember my eyebrows back to my scalp when you and Mary were giving that talk. So, sitting here having a conversation, we come a long way. So, what last piece of advice would you want to leave, with those in the audience, who may be, having some issues, maybe scared to bring it up, or maybe brought it up but don't have satisfactory answers, or just really trying to navigate the space? What piece of advice would you give them?
Yeah, I mean, my number one piece of advice would make a commitment to have, to make one small change, to have one small conversation, and to let it grow from there. I mean, none of this gets fixed overnight, not your MS, not your sexual functioning, not your depression. All of these things are long-term commitments to change. And so, but just so, and just like with exercise, making that commitment to park just a little further away, I would say, if you've been someone who's been putting it on the back burner, I would say the one thing to do is remember you are worth having the kind of sex life that you want to have, and to put it on the front burner and to do one small thing that says, I deserve to have a good sex life, whatever that, whether it's buying yourself a new toy, talking to your therapist the next time, talking to one, just making a commitment to doing one change that puts it on the front burner. That's what I would say.
I love it. And I could not have said it any better. Thank you so much, Dr. Steppelman, Lara, for coming on and having this great discussion with us. Thank you so much to our viewers. Thank you to our sponsors, the National MS Society and Genentech. And we will see you in 2 weeks for another Brain Chat.